I've been asked about my opinion on Hotline Miami a lot recently, and I've played through it a bunch in order to sort of collect my thoughts on it. And my conclusion is probably not what a lot of you might be expecting. The game's been viewed by many as a criticism of game violence. It uses lilting camera angles and muted neon colors to drive home a subtext of the gameplay being off or wrong. And at times the game calls you a bad person and asks if you enjoy hurting other people. It's a violent game that seems aware of and willing to comment on the nature of that violence. And honestly, that's a fair reading of the game, and I don't really disagree with it. But there are already a lot of places writing about the game in that context. Maddie Meyer's write-up in particular was pretty good. I don't want to try and cover well-tread ground, so instead today I'm going to propose a slightly different reading of the game. First, let me play devil's advocate and argue why the game isn't necessarily about violence. The game's reward structures are all about encouraging murderous acts. You get combos for killing faster and with greater variety, and if you play well, you unlock new weapons and masks to help you in your task of killing lots of people. Mechanically, the game never condemns the violence that happens and actually does a lot to encourage it. And neither the player nor the player characters ever really have to face any consequences for their actions. The game asks if you like hurting people and then lets you hurt a lot of people, and I think that dissonance was what stuck out in people's minds after playing the game. So while I think that violence is certainly a subject brought up by the game, I sort of struggle to interpret it as a hardcore anti-violence screed. So if the game's not about violence, what am I proposing the game's about? I kind of think the game represents a rejection of game narrative and the contextualization of play through metaphor. It is, in effect, a game that argues there's nothing more important than the mechanics and the way they impact a player. Its criticisms with game narrative have less in common with Spec Ops and more in common with, say, the Stanley Parable. But while the Stanley Parable is content to simply highlight the eternal conflict between player choice and an authored narrative, Hotline Miami takes the idea one step further and outright rejects narrative as a justification for why gameplay happens or is pleasurable. What people seem to ignore when they bring up the whole "do you like hurting other people" question is that it's just one of 4 questions. The others being, who is leaving messages on your answering machine? Where are you right now? And why are we having this conversation? The first question about violence feels somewhat rhetorical, but the other 3 are definitely not rhetorical. They draw focus to mysteries inside the narrative of who and where and why. Where am I, and who am I killing, and why am I killing them, and how does this cutscene apart from the rest of the gameplay and murders totally fit into the rest of this? And it brings those questions to light because, at least for the first 11 or so levels, which is basically half of Hotline Miami's length, the game doesn't offer any substantive answers. It sort of lets the gameplay run the show for a while before it begins to show its hand. You unlock some weapons, you earn some masks, and aim for high scorer ratings while gunning guys down and beating guys up while jamming to one of the best soundtracks of the year. The game lets you lose yourself in it and push those questions brought up in the beginning mostly to the side. But those narrative questions are always there in the background. Why is the same guy giving me free stuff everywhere I go? Why does Jacket feel compelled to murder? What are those red symbols everywhere? They fester in the recesses of your mind while you're more concerned with how to take out 3 guys with just a baseball bat. But slowly they bubble to the top as the outside world becomes increasingly hostile and you begin seeing talking corpses and violent imagery. Ultimately they accumulate with the death of the only female character in the game and your admission to the hospital. And the hospital section that so many people hate is actually really interesting. The gameplay here is completely different than the rest of the game. You're totally disempowered. Your weapons are gone, you can't hurt anyone, line of sight instantly kills you, and you can't walk more than a few feet without pausing. The music is more ambient and low tempo, and in place of hot pinks and purples, the level is mostly white. This is the game presenting a version of itself where the mechanics aren't balanced to feel good in your hands, and you don't have a pulsing soundtrack and eye-popping colors to generate a sense of synesthesia. Basically, this is the game showing you what would happen if its mechanics more or less sucked. You're not supposed to enjoy it because it's disenfranchised you from everything that made the game function to begin with. It'd be like if there was a section of Doom that took away all of your weapons and forced you to navigate a map at half speed while avoiding insta-death projectiles from imps. The result is that this scene shows how good the game feels when it does work. But it's also interesting because once you've completed it and have seen how the game can't properly function without its mercurial mix of visuals, music, and gameplay, but can function without meaningful plot, Jacket's story begins taking focus. From the moment the unnamed woman gets shot, the rest of his tale is a by-the-numbers revenge fantasy, compete with an obligatory video game boss fight at the end. So you have 11 levels of awesome gameplay, visuals, and music that have little to no context, 1 level of stilted and broken gameplay with washed out visuals and tempered music, and 3 more levels of awesome gameplay, visuals, and music, but this time with a story arc. And you know, those last 3 levels really aren't all that different from the first 11. And really I feel that's what Jacket's story does. It attempts to show that having a player character with a motivation doesn't substantially change how players experience mechanics. The game was just as tense and engaging when you had no idea why you were killing all of these guys as it was when you were on some sort of revenge-based empowerment fantasy. The story isn't what is meaningful to your experience. The game succeeds based solely on the strength of its raw playstyle, visuals, and soundtrack, and wants you to be aware of that. But then the game rewinds to a previous mission where you, Jacket, killed a man in a biker helmet. Except this time you're playing Helmet and you kill Jacket. From this point on, it's Helmet's story. Jacket is presumably dead, or at least in a serious coma, and he and his girlfriend are never brought back up. Think about what this means. It completely invalidates the first half of the game's narrative. At best it means that Jacket is a completely unreliable narrator and nothing you experienced while playing that character necessarily happened, or at least happened that particular way. At worst, it basically splits the game into 2 timelines where each narrative is played out. Regardless, the result is that at least the first 11 and possibly the first 15 missions of the game can't be placed in a proper or meaningful narrative context. By invalidating the narrative, the game attempts to show that narrative had no bearing on whether those experiences were worthwhile. No one feels robbed when they pull the "it was all a dream" thing here, just kinda confused. But really, no more confused than when we had no idea what we were doing to begin with. Unlike Jacket, who is content to kill without really asking any questions, Helmet is determined to get out of this whole murder gig, or at a minimum, get answers. Unlike Jacket, he is concerned with who the people are leaving him messages on his answering machine. Where Jacket represents players engaging in mechanics without asking questions and embracing the joy of play that ensues, Helmet represents the player who seeks validation and context through narrative. And what happens to Helmet once he confronts the cleaners who were responsible for his torment? Well, the default ending is more or less a fourth wall breaking interaction with the developers in which they tell you that there was no point, but that doesn't matter because you managed to have fun with it and they're making a lot of money. I mean, it isn't even really subtle. They intentionally drop words like "we did it independently" and "just a game" during the dialogue to make it pretty clear these are pretty much self-insertion figures. And their message as the creators of this game to the players is basically, "It's over, I hope you had fun." But if you're a completionist, you can reject that answer. The computer in the last level that taunts players with answers if they can just get the password promises true resolution to the story. This lets players tell themselves that there really is a point to it all, that the first ending was just not being honest about it, and if you work hard enough, you can get that true answer. And so if you go level by level and painstakingly collect small floating purple pixels, they'll each give you a letter to the password on the computer used by the cleaners. Use the password and interrogate them again, and you'll find out the big dark secret of the game. This is the big answer, the ultimate payoff, the thing players who embody Helmet and wanted a where and a why and a how to their game so badly that they spent hours combing over the entirety of the game for small floating purple pixels that fought so hard to get. And the result is a slightly altered dialogue between the cleaners and Helmet that throws out a stereotypical video game bad guys who want to take over the world shtick. Notably, the scene even ends with Helmet telling the 2 cleaners, who are developer stand-ins, keep in mind, that they've wasted enough of his time. And this is how Hotline Miami ends, not by filling in the blanks, but by laughing at players who wanted blanks meaningfully filled in. As for the recurring commentary on its violence, which I acknowledge is totally a thread that runs through the length of the game, Hotline Miami uses the dissonance between the violence you're committing and the real-world response to violence to highlight how unimportant the metaphor wrapping mechanics can be. The game shows you puking corpses and mutilated bodies outside of the context of their mechanics, and suddenly all of that narrative context that doesn't matter one whit while you're pounding some dude's face in with a pipe is at the forefront. A bloody corpse makes sense in the context of the mechanics, but removed from those mechanics, it's something to be questioned. They're no longer targets or threats, but suddenly they're characters, even if barely an interactive one. Hotline Miami argues, at least in part, that mechanics nullify meaning by contextualizing metaphors with respects to the game systems and not with real life. For example, a Space Marine in a cutscene is a character that warrants empathy and emotional attachment, while a Space Marine in gameplay is a resource to be spent in pursuit of a goal. The game also asks if you like hurting other people. Of course you don't actually like hurting people, you are, presumably anyway, a well-adjusted person who doesn't delight in sadistic torture. Yet you're playing this game about beating the bejesus out of people and having a fairly great time while doing it. Why? It's not because you like beating people up, it's because you like the synesthesia of neon lights and music and mechanics, the puzzle of figuring out how to tackle each floor and the adrenaline rush of executing that plan, the interplay of mechanics and the representation. This is a game and the core mechanics sing to you above all other considerations. Hotline Miami dredges up the old narratology-ludology false debate and pitches its tent as far into ludology territory as it possibly can. Hotline Miami suggests that narrative is meaningless and metaphors are irrelevant. What matters is how mechanics make you feel. Of course, the problem with all of this is that the position of rejecting narrative isn't really tenable. Metaphor and story do have meaning, they do contextualize play. It's what separates Spec Ops from Call of Duty. It's pretty much entirely what makes The Walking Dead so worth playing. It's the fundamental basis of interactive fiction pieces like those built in Twine. Games have the power to recontextualize symbols by placing them in systems other than the real world. But just because they're being recontextualized doesn't mean they lose all real-world value at the door. I mean, if Call of Duty had you shooting puppies instead of having you shoot quote-unquote enemies of freedom, it would be a fundamentally different game. Hotline Miami would like you to think that all that matters is the core gunplay. Anyways, I know I've been doing a lot of complaining regarding games about games lately, but in this case I find it at least somewhat refreshing because it's about the structure of the form rather than its content. Again, it's more Stanley Parable than Spec Ops. And while I may disagree with the game's thesis that core mechanics and minute-to-minute play trump any sort of narrative or metaphorical contextualization, I do think it's neat that we've reached a game that doesn't just talk about what's in a game, but rather what games are. And the truth is, that's a question we're still trying to answer.